All right. So good evening and welcome to the fourth of our community conversations, Presidential Transition Teams, Function, Importance, and Political and Public Voice. I'm Nancy Burns, the Warren E. Miller Collegiate Professor of Political Science and the Chair of the Political Science Department. This week, our community conversation, Presidential Transition Teams, Function, Importance, and Public Voice, will help shed light on the phenomenon of the presidential election cycle that occurs after the election and before inauguration, the creation of a transition team. Transition teams lay the groundwork for any incoming administration, but their importance and impact tend to be opaque for many. And so tonight, we're really fortunate to have two experts with deep knowledge of the processes that drive Washington, D.C. and incoming administrations. Kenneth Lowande is an assistant professor of political science here at the University of Michigan. His work focuses on presidential power, congressional oversight, and bureaucratic policymaking. Chantelle Renn serves as special advisor for transition and management at the Nonpartisan Center for Presidential Transition. And we are really delighted that she could find time in her extremely busy schedule at the moment to join us. A couple of housekeeping notes. Our speakers are going to chat for roughly 35 minutes, and then they're going to turn to audience questions. And so please feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A box. This session is being live streamed and the recording is going to be available for later viewing. And lastly, I want to take a moment to recognize Edie Goldenberg and Cindy Bank for their help in organizing this session. And I want to give a special thanks to Mark Rivette and Erica Coliane, who are working the technical magic behind the scenes. And with that, Penny and Chantelle, the floor is yours.
Thanks.
Great, thank you. It's so lovely to be here. It's a little bit like looking at each other at a stop sign and wondering who's going to go first. So as Nancy said, we're going to keep it informal and conversational. And yeah, it really is a thrill to be with everyone here this afternoon, this evening. Kenny, I might just, if you're happy for me to kick it off, and then maybe I'll pose a question to you. We'll do it that way. How's that sound?
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Oh, all right, let's go. Fantastic. Well, as I said, I love transitions. I think they're fascinated by them. I think they say a lot about a country, and you know, in America, we've had over 200 years of peaceful transitions of power, and they've really been a bedrock of the American system. And trust that they'll continue. And yeah, as I said, I'm from the Partnership for Public Service at the Centre. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organisation, so I'm going to stick to the script on the transition process. Really, I know there's a lot of interest at the moment around election results and the like. So as Nancy ably said, it's, I guess, for approximately 75 days every 4 years, you have intense interest, planning and analysis around the transition of power, as I've said, from a first term or a second term administration. And we're, expecting and we're seeing preparations for that transition to a first term moment. So with that, Kenny, I might pose the opening question to you. I mean, why do presidential transitions matter? Why have them at all?
Yeah, this is a good place to start because, well, for the first point, I teach a class on the American presidency, and I admit that I know shockingly little about the details of this process. So I'm really glad to be chatting with you about this tonight. But one of the things that I first start out with to talk to students about is just reminding them kind of what the job of the presidency is like. And this helps illustrate kind of why we have transitions and why so much preparation is important, right? So people in the business world usually like to think about the president as kind of the CEO of the government, but really they're the CEO of like a couple hundred different organizations with different goals that are sometimes in conflict. They don't have a shared measure of success like profit. Most of the employees work outside of Washington. There are 2 million civilian employees, a couple more million contractors. That's more than the 6 largest firms in the US, so it's a huge job. They have to do a tremendous amount of hiring. They hire around 4,000 political appointees right at the start. And they have to an incredible short amount of time to do this. And at the end of the day, for all of their ambitious policy goals, they're really dependent on other actors like Congress and the judiciary for their authority and for their resources. So it's really difficult. It's like having a bunch of activist shareholders whose interests sometimes diverge from management. And then to kick it all off, I mean, and a lot of times presidents are taking the reins during a crisis, sort of like the crisis from 2008 to 2009. And now the present economic and public health crisis that we're facing now. Mm. So that said, their broad kind of tasks, as I understand them, are: one, they have to hire a bunch of people. Most of these aren't confirmed by the Senate, so they have to staff up, and they have to staff up relatively quickly. They have to find people to fill important jobs in the government. They have to get organized. And the way at least I think about this is, okay, presidents make, thousands of decisions, choices between policy A or policy B. During the transition, they're really deciding how they're going to make those decisions in the future, right? So there's a long process that leads up to the point of a President Biden choosing between this policy or that policy, and they have to figure out how that planning process is going to work. And then lastly, they usually set their agenda at this time, right? So they decide what they're going to do in what order, whether they're going to focus on healthcare versus immigration or whatever pressing issue they might be concerned with, sort of from day one. So, I mean, that sort of exhausts most of my knowledge about this. So Chantelle, can you give us kind of an overview of what the transition framework actually looks like in practice?
Sure. I am expecting you will have undersold yourself, Kimmy. We'll get to you when we get into the policy discussion, I'm sure at the end. Yeah, no, it's a great, great overview about why it matters. And I guess to add to, you mentioned, the 2008-9 transition taking place against the backdrop of a global financial crisis. You almost see kind of 4 crises at the moment playing out with the economy, COVID. I said 4. I can only remember 2, but there are several going on. I know that addressing climate change and racial equality are 2 other priorities for at least the Biden-Harris transition team that they have identified. So, and I guess the point I'd make before I kind of launch into the framework here is that it's a vulnerable time for the country, right? You talked, Kenny, about it's a massive transition exercise. You think about, you lose like a Fortune 500 company and you lose your top leadership in kind of less than 75 days. Like, it's a lot of knowledge that turns over. You think back to the Bush administration in their first term. President George W. Bush faced 9/11 in September. Thinking through back to Clinton's first term, you had the World Trade Center bombing and the Waco standoff. So, and we've mentioned, the global financial crisis as well. So it is important to do right, I guess, is my point. As I said, making sure that there are guardrails, there's a framework to make sure that transition happens effectively in an orderly way. So that brings me to legislation, and many people hit the snooze button, but I guess the overarching framework for presidential transition is the Presidential Transition Act. And so, it's great that transitions aren't left up to chance. And this act has been amended over the years with strong bipartisan support. In fact, Senator Ted Kaufman, who is a co-chair of the President-elect Biden transition team, he was the author of several of key amendments to that act that exist today. So I thought that connection might be of interest to draw out. The act essentially requires the White House and agencies to begin transition planning well before elections. And that's to benefit both the first and the second term. And it also requires an agency that we've probably heard a little bit more about in the last couple of weeks, the General Services Administration, to provide office space and support services to presidents and vice presidents elect after the election, and to presidential candidates after the last nominating convention. So that's just like a broad kind of very, very broad summary of the framework. I thought it might be interesting then to give you a few examples of things that act has established. You have the agency transition directors. So each agency has to designate a senior career official that will lead transition planning in their agencies. And what these agency transition directors do is they'll prepare briefing materials and succession plans for the career officials who may be acting in positions that are vacated by outgoing appointees before new appointees arrive. And by law, those materials are prepared no later than November 1. These agency transition directors, they are members of a standing council called the Agency Transition Directors Council. And so what this council does is essentially coordinate a lot of the transition activities across the federal agencies. It's co-chaired by the Federal Transition Coordinator, which is a senior position at GSA, as well as the Office of Management and Budget's Deputy Director for Management. So that gives you a sense of the leadership there, and there's a rep from each agency, as I said, the career officials, the Agency Transition Director. It also allows for a representative of the candidates to join post-convention as well. Then by May of an election year, so 6 months out from the election, there's a White House Transition Coordinating Council that is established. And that council provides guidance to agencies, as well as facilitates communication between the administration and the transition team. That council is chaired by the White House Chief of Staff, and you also have other high-level officials on that, such as cabinet officers. You've got the directors of office management and budget, as I said, personnel management, Office of Government Ethics, as well as the administrator of GSA. And interestingly, I found this the archivist of the United States, given there is presidential or there's legislation around the preservation of transition records. So that is some examples of what is in that legislation. And there are also national security provisions in the legislation as well. For example, the FBI conducting background investigations of President-elect's high-level national security positions, as well as a classified security briefing as soon as possible after the election. Again, I'm outlining kind of the framework and the process. It doesn't always in real life happen as like to T, but those are some of the statutory requirements, if you will, around presidential transition planning. I might move on. Kenny, I might be interesting to folk just to then move into the role and function of the transition team, and yeah, jump in. If you're good, I'll keep going. I'm conscious. I'm going. Gotcha. I'm conscious. I'm talking at people. So then, I guess, given the statutory framework, thinking about the role and the function of a presidential transition team, again, as both Nancy and Kenny talked about why transitions matter, the primary role and function of a presidential transition team is to prepare the president-elect for day one. One of the inescapable features of the timeline for transition is the calendar. You have an election and you have an inauguration, and you've got a set time to prepare in between there. And if you think about the anatomy of a presidential transition, you really have kind of three key players, of which the presidential transition team is one. You have federal career officials, which we talked about, as well as the incumbent administration, including the White House, as we mentioned previously as well. Yeah. That sounds good. Yeah, sorry.
I mean, given the focus on people on the timeline now, maybe it's useful to go right to sort of what is the order in which this normally would happen, right? What are the broad kind of stages of what a transition can actually looks like when when everything's working normally? Since I'm
Sure.
we might get some questions about deviations from norms.
Got it. No, I'm happy to. And I would say, generally speaking, you have kind of 4 phases. The first one really kind of setting up the organization of a transition team, and that generally happens around from May through to the conventions. During this phase, you'll have transition team leadership that's appointed, and the team itself will get built. You have a team charter, you'll establish some of the coordination norms, if you will, between the candidate and the campaign, and that generally happens by the transition chair or co-chair, depending on the leadership structure. So then once you've got the setup, the second phase is kind of the planning phase, really, and you've got here from the conventions to the election. And in this phase, you'll have the transition teams that largely focus on kind of documenting the candidate's campaign promises. You'll have them identifying some of the priority White House positions and other leadership positions. They'll develop president-elect support functions and also kind of prepare to scale the transition team post-election. So those 2 phases kind of happen, say like a distinct phase, but they tend to be like in the beginning stages of the setup of a presidential transition team. And those 2 phases happening pre-election.
So,
sorry, Ken.
Since all of that happens before the election, how much of this is happening on the side of the current administration versus the candidates, doing this sort of on their own?
I think I understand your question. In terms of, let me put it this way: the transition team planning or the transition team setup generally will happen like up until this point in the background. In some cases, you don't have pre-convention, you don't have a nominee yet. And so the focus is on the presidential campaign itself, and the presidential transition team tends to take a bit of a back seat. In addition to what I mentioned before, in an election year, you'll have the administration and you'll have the career officials planning in accordance with some of those statutory requirements. So it's kind of how it all like moves together, if you will, in terms of the what's in the foreground and what's in the background. So with that, let me see. So then you kind of move to the transition phase, which essentially is where we are now, right? How did we get to here? I keep harking back to the 75-day period. If you count between day after election and inauguration this year, it's 78 days. Anyway, so here is where we're expecting a transfer of power. The election results are in. And then again, talking to the process here, then the transition team will begin working with the outgoing administration to support kind of the continuity of operations and personnel. Thinking through some of the outgoing appointees in preparing for some of those, more than 4,000 appointees for incoming. In this stage, you'll have agency review teams being deployed. The agency review function is one of the key work streams for a transition team. And what they do is essentially go and get a sense of the key issues facing agencies to develop kind of briefings and detailed briefings for an incoming team. And so those agency review teams will be deployed. There'll be receipt of national security briefings. And then your policy team, which is another major work stream on the transition team, will be developed. You'll also have, appointments being announced. And I think everyone who's reading the headlines, can see that, the Biden transition team announced Ron Klain as the president-elect's chief of staff, as well as some senior White House appointments. So I should say on the agency review side, also just to demonstrate in real time kind of the process playing out, you have agency review teams and members of those teams which have been published, if you will, or they're on the Biden-Harris transition team website. So again, you can see that kind of playing out in real time. let me see. And then kind of the last phase, if you will, it's kind of go time. You know, everything builds up to inauguration, and what after inauguration is generally referred to kind of as the first 100, 200 days, which generally leads you kind of up until the August recess for Congress, thinking through kind of appointments, targets, etc. So that's helpful for folks, just to give you like a really high level outline of some of those kind of 4 phases of a presidential transition, touching on some of the functions such as agency review, appointments, and policy development there.
So as far as timeline, are all of those, how set in stone are those phases? And then in particular on the last one, you know, I know from that, you know, the first 100 days is this kind of, it's this thing that the media likes to talk about, and it's worked its way into
Right.
but there's nothing special about, you know, 100 days in the president's administration. So I'm wondering if that timeline too is kind of set in stone for the way they plan their policy.
No, it's a good point. I mean, the simple way of saying it is, I think the first 100 days is more about creating momentum. You know, especially with a first term administration, typically, you know, the momentum from the campaign, you're shifting from campaign to governing, and generally speaking, there's a lot of momentum that a candidate, a president-elect, can use coming into office to push through many of their policy priorities, like the getting ready to govern on day one. But yeah, as I said, it's more, if I use the term loosely, like a convention or a practice, that's seen as like a time period for achievement to reflect on. You'll generally hear day one priorities, first 100, 200 days. And the other thing I guess I'll say in relation to that is you'll have like implementation plans. So when a transition team will develop the policy plans, they also generally have that purview of like 100, 200 days. So thinking through what's the sequencing of implementation, what can you do in that time frame as well. So that's, I guess, the other thing I'd mention regarding kind of that time frame. Back to your question around the phases, I would say, I think I already said before, around you kind of got your hard deadline of the election. You've got, you know, obviously that the conventions are important point in the planning, because post-convention, that's where you'll have the transition team kind of come into to more of the foreground. You know, you'll have parties selecting their candidate, and then you doing there is, yes, the campaign, and I should say, you know, that's where the campaign really comes into gear, with the transition kind of stepping up to prepare for what might happen post-election. So anyway, a long way of saying around the first 2 phases tend to be a little bit more flexible, noting that you kind of got an election day, you've got inauguration, and then you kind of got that first term of a new administration like we're facing now. But I've done a lot of talking here, Kenny, and I know that I want to kind of touch on some of your expertise around, you know, policy making process, particularly thinking through levers for execution, etc. So I would be interested, like, if you could share with the group some of your views on how, you know, policy, you know, talk us through some of that determination, how policy gets made or determined for a new incoming administration.
Yeah, I mean, it's now convention for most presidents to have, like you said, try to get some momentum on policymaking going, get some kind of wins together. And I think that this incoming administration, we're likely to see the same kind of behavior. This usually happens with them sort of setting the agenda with some kind of presidential directive or sets of presidential directives. You saw that in the Trump administration. You know, in the first week, there are a number of really important directives that he signed that, you know, we were talking about for months after that. And that's the kind of thing that I would expect to happen now. You know, you know, it wouldn't shock me at all, for example, if, you know, there's a policy that's sometimes referred to as the Mexico City policy that determines whether or not foreign aid can go to organizations who provide abortions or abortion services abroad. And that's prime example of a policy that's flipped every time we had a change in party control of the presidency. And it's something that they tend to sign kind of on day one. But I mean, with all of these things, and I think, and you could probably add to this, and this goes to the political context, what really matters is follow through, in part because of, and in part because of the political environment that we're in, right? So most of the things that I imagine will be announced in January that the Biden administration will do, they could have big, important policy consequences in the long term, but they could also not. You could think about things like, well, President Obama established the DACA program, but also on day one, he signed a Guantanamo Bay, an order closing Guantanamo Bay, and Guantanamo Bay is still open. And likewise, there are a lot of directives the Trump administration enacted that didn't result in any sort of change. So, long story short, these staffing decisions and setting their priorities really matters, because once this order's signed, whether it actually changes anything is entirely up to the structure and the people that they have in place. So that's kind of how
Yeah, okay. I just was reflecting on the title for this session, thinking around the public voice aspect to the policy making process. And I guess just building on what you've talked about, like your thoughts on how the public might have a voice in the process.
This. So as you said, I mean, it's really normal for transitions to have working groups that are put together, and the representatives of those working groups represent different interests oftentimes, right? And being a part of a presidential transition is a big thing if you are part of an advocacy organization, showing that you're part of the incoming administration. So I guess my answer to that question would probably be, if you have an organization that advocates in Washington for issues that matter to you, those organizations are really well equipped to take part in this process and it's normal for them to. So by supporting them, you can, in a way, have a public voice. I don't know. Right. What would you say?
Well, I was thinking about this because so I'm based in Washington D.C. I know, no surprises there. I realize it's probably an obvious thing to stay. But one of the things that I really enjoy is just the number of fantastic good government management groups that exist. And so I'm thinking, kind of taking a broader definition of the public voice, if you will, to just seeing such a lot of great material being developed and recommendations on how you can improve government effectiveness. Making government work more effectively for the American people, which, is I would argue the role of government, right? To make sure that it operates effectively. And it's definitely what my organization cares a lot about. And our mission is to support that. So anyway, all that to say, I guess I would think about the public voice in the policy making process is through being able to contribute expertise and recommendations about what you might offer, or how an administration can fix some of the more intractable management issues that aren't always talked about, not necessarily the sexy issue of the day. I use sexy kind of equating those to some of the challenges. I don't mean that to be disparaging, but the things not so high profile is probably a better way of saying that. And so I guess that's what excites me about the ability to contribute and influence good government and good government management is through some of those recommendations and the expertise about how you make government work more effectively. It's top of mind there.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of things that the government does that are just totally nonpartisan. Forecasting the direction of hurricanes. Right. We want the best people leading the agency that does that, right?
Right.
So getting a head start and getting them at their desk really, or in this case, getting them in front of their Zoom camera really matters.
Right. There's a couple of questions coming in. I know we talked for about 35 minutes or so before we go to questions, but I saw there's one question here around, that every transition is unique, perhaps some more so than others, and other examples of presidential transitions that went particularly well, and a resounding yes. I would refer to the Bush-Obama transition in 2008-09. We kind of refer to that and have some material on our website around the gold standard for transition. At the time, President Bush made very public remarks about how important it was for his administration to prepare for there to be an effective and peaceful transfer of power. And again, we talked about kind of transitions during times of crisis. At the time you had the global financial crisis kind of unloading, kind of evolving really in real time as you're preparing that transition of power. And I think what made it what made it so well was, I think, the cooperation. So the commitment of the team to be able to the commitment of the team to be able to work with the incoming administration through briefings, through intergovernmental coordination, through intelligence briefings, etc. So I would say often those some of the hallmarks of what I call a gold standard of transition. I don't know if Kenny, you had thoughts on your what you would consider to be a best practice transition.
No, I think that about sums it up, actually.
Great.
Maybe we can take the second question here. So second question, how able will the incoming administration be to reverse executive orders immediately after inauguration? And then the second part of that question is, will it depend at all on who controls the Senate? So the short answer to this question is yes, they could they could write one executive order that says all of the executive orders that the Trump administration issued are revoked. So that's the short answer, but whether or not that actually reverses the policy is a little bit different. So I guess you take a couple of examples. This wasn't an executive order, but it's an executive action that I already mentioned DACA. The Trump administration wanted to reverse DACA, but in order to reverse DACA, they had to, they had to take something away from a group of beneficiaries. Those beneficiaries sued and they were successful. And so they could technically reverse it, but it takes a lot longer it's now going to take them a lot longer to reverse it. Another example would be something like the border wall. You could say on day one, there is not a state of emergency on the border, and you could immediately halt construction. But a lot of the walls already been built. They've already been demoing the necessary areas and acquiring the land that's necessary to do it. So if you want to really make it take policy back to before the Trump administration, it takes a lot more effort and time. And it really kind of depends on what the action was. So they could revoke all these on day one, but it's going to take a lot of effort and sort of managerial know-how, both in court and outside to figure out how to do that. And then the last one, or the second part of that question, will it depend at all on who controls the Senate? My guess is probably not, because most of these are, you wouldn't, yeah. Again, it probably depends on the policy area, which is, it depends is like a kind of mealy mouth, not great answer, but that's all I got. I don't know if you have anything to add, Chantelle.
I got nothing to add on that, but on the executive actions, I might add on that. the centre did some research looking at the number of executive actions used by past administrations in coming back to the first 100 days. And what I found really interesting there is actually there's quite a few executive actions that are issued by presidents in their first 100 days as a way to execute things quickly. I don't opine on why that is, rather the fact that you can do, an executive order, while it has its limitations, is a relatively straightforward, clumsy way of saying it, to get something done, if you will. And I think you'll see that, and no doubt, transition teams coming back to the phases, particularly in the policy teams, thinking about whether your levers for implementation, whether you use, what type of executive action, or if you want to pursue legislative, change for that. If I give a plug for our presidential transition guide in the first 700 days, the first 100 days, was some analysis that we did, is that President Trump issued around 71 executive actions, compared with Obama 49 actions, W. Bush 46 executive actions, Clinton 47, and so on. So and we have further breakdown there, but they are used, and they're generally used within kind of that first term. It's not uncommon. So I got to add on that.
Sure. Here's a question that you could probably answer. This is sort of a follow-up to our, how does the public, or what role does the public play in this process? Someone wrote, while we can rely on advocacy groups to meet with the transition team, will there be opportunities for individuals or even campus groups to do the same kind of thing, right? Or is there kind of like a petition system, or is there some way that the current transition team is taking kind of public comments?
Gotcha. I mean, I don't have any inside knowledge of that. I will say that the previous transition teams, and I imagine the Biden-Harris transition team will use their transition website to as a formal mechanism to seek feedback from the public and suggestions. So to offer that and to sign up, it seems rudimentary to say sign up for the updates, but in the past, that has been an effective way to get from the transition teams updates on the things that they care about, and enable more informed participation. Again, this is not my professional hat on, but just thinking around a lot of the not public protests, but advocacy, if you will, the public advocacy, that is listened to and written about and seen. And again, this is just more like a personal observation. I don't discount that as a way of communicating, things that are important during this time of transition and what matters to people, through the election process. If that answers the question, but perhaps a simplistic and a macro way to answer that question. So, and also, practically, the transition websites are set up for that purpose, or not just that purpose, but that is a function as well.
And on that same topic, right, speaking of voice, right, someone's asked us, how are these agency review teams chosen, particularly noting the fact that there are representatives of the University of Michigan on those agency review teams. Michael Barr, Betsy Stevenson, and Bart McQuaid are all on agency review teams. So how did those people get picked? Oh,
well, I mean, I would say, and I guess our learned friends probably add a lot more insight than I can in my answer here, but you'll generally have folk that what is desirable on an agency review team is knowledge of federal government, some, in many cases, experience working in many of those positions. The job of that team is to shed light, as I said before, for an incoming team about what they'll face going forward. So it's probably less about how do they get chosen and more, what is a transition team leadership looking for as you transition team staff up, if you will, like what are the skills and experience and networks that they're looking for. I think about, in addition to those you mentioned, Chris Lew is leading the Department of Labor Agency review team, and he was the executive director of the Clinton-Kane transition. No, I've got that completely wrong. My previous transition team. I'm getting my names mixed up. It's a little bit embarrassing. But anyway, he was basically with that experience, if you will, there for knowing Department of Labor and going there. He was he served as on Obama's team as well. I've totally messed that up. I apologize to Chris Lew. I hope he doesn't watch. But yeah, so how do people get chosen? It's really basically the expertise and knowledge of kind of the agency. Right. Many will serve in a volunteer capacity. So many will be handling the agency review contribution in addition to a full-time job.
So we mostly have been talking about normal things. Maybe we could switch to a couple of questions that are all in the category of, what's abnormal about the present transition. So the first question is, or that sort of popped up for us was, since the Trump administration continually breaks democratic norms, at what point does it become applicable or legal, and when can and should the Biden team seek some sort of solution in court? Do you have any special insight into this? I have one potential answer, but I'm not a lawyer, and I should emphasize that.
Yeah, I'm even less of not a lawyer than you, so I'm going to defer to your insight that you have.
Well, the only insight that I have is you outlined for us very nicely the phases of this transition. It's a finite amount of time, and it's hard for me to think of any legal remedy that would be quick enough to make any kind of difference. So, if the ascertainment happens when all the results are certified, that's in a couple of weeks. Someone would have to sue, they would have to get a hearing, and they would have to get a decision in a very short period of time. So it's hard for me to imagine that as a way that they go. I don't know, maybe you could disagree.
I don't know. I don't know. I think I'm going to just rest on the I don't know for that one. Yeah.
I'm more willing to speculate. I don't have anything at stake here.
Yeah. I don't have anything intelligent to say on the matter, well, particularly for that one. But yeah, no, that sounds about right.
Is there any other these questions you particularly want to answer?
Let me see. I'm just looking through. Sorry, everyone. There's a lot coming through, and they're great. One is one about timeline within the transition process for announcing cabinet picks and other key roles, noting that there have been some Biden team announcements in recent days, but none for cabinet level posts. Again, I would offer that I don't have any inside information on that other than, you will generally see, and I have seen in the media reports around, the cabinet, expecting cabinet nominees to cabinet level position coming shortly. So I'm sorry, it's a bit of a non-answer, but they are, they are kind of in the bucket of important appointments or appointees that that are necessary to be ready to govern from day one.
Maybe we could talk to address this other question about what areas are could potentially be damaged without a smooth transition. So this person writes, everybody's pointing to COVID and national security as areas that potentially threatened by a delay in beginning an orderly transition. And then what else is seriously threatened or could potentially lead to bad outcomes if there isn't kind of preparation leading up.
Yeah, I'm just sorry, I'm just lost that one. So I get the question there about what impacts that there might be as a result of, sorry, can you say that again? Thank you. Point is COVID and national security. Yeah, it's two areas seriously threatened. Gosh, I don't know. I mean, I guess I would answer that by saying, you know, the operation of government is deep and complicated, and a lot of it is not seen, and you know, you just have like an opportunity cost in some ways for not having you know, an effective operation for government, both in terms of what's responding to things that are happening now, and COVID and national security are two areas that have been mentioned, and a lot of other kind of unseen areas. Honestly, I'm blanking on a good example, and I'll kick myself afterwards there. But I guess the other point that I'd make is, like, there are preparations that are happening. You know, that the Biden transition team are receiving briefings from experts. You know, you have a lot of experienced members of the team who know how government worked, have served in government before, and so, like, that is, I would say, that's a good thing. That even though there are some consequences of an election result, if you like, not being ascertained yet, you know, preparation is still happening. And so, you know, and you can see that in terms of some of the public announcements, national security briefings, COVID briefings. I've mentioned the two issues that we said, what else? But I guess I would kind of frame it in that way, that the preparation is happening, you know, and the career officials have done a fantastic job in getting prepared, and having as much as they can ready to go. So yeah, I would offer that. I don't know, Kenny, if you've got any more insights. I'm a little bit, yeah, think a bit more about that one.
Yeah, I mean, I would emphasize your point, which is, yeah, so one, government does a lot of things that are unseen, but even in this case, even something as important as national security or you know, the public health response to the global pandemic, it's extremely difficult to connect the dots between the decisions that are being made right now about preparation and outcomes that might happen years from now, right? Potentially, especially in the realm of national security, where there's so much information that just doesn't get back to us, right? We can't know what the ultimate result is. And I think that's mostly what, you know, why folks who are in that space are raising alarm bells, not because of what they know with certainty will happen, but the uncertainty around the consequences of potentially not having adequate preparation.
Right. And I mean, I would add as well, you know, there's a lot of, seriously threats, probably not the right way to say it, but for example, you know, you see the Biden Harris transition team that are having calls with national leaders from other countries. They're releasing the statements on those calls, etc. Usually that process is facilitated by the State Department. So that's like an example that's kind of going outside of government, because they're not able to, you know, State Department isn't able to provide that.
Right.
Sorry, say again.
You can still pick up the phone. So.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And you know, I hark back to this again. You know, you have many briefings. You know, you've got these agency transition directors and career staff to, you know, help inform, you know, future appointees, and that's important. You know, to be, you know, the part of preparing to govern. That's an important part of that preparation that isn't able to happen as thoroughly as it could be. Like, I guess I would answer that question in that way.
Yeah. Then we have another question here, sort of in the category of, you know, what can the incoming administration reverse? So this person wrote, does the outgoing president and Congress traditionally rush to fill federal judgeships and other open assignable positions during the transition period, and can or are they typically reversed by the new administration?
Oh, sorry to pass on that one. I just don't have anything to add there. I'm not sure. Kenny, you would know more than me on that one.
I know that the judgeships can't be reversed unless for some reason these judges do something really bad. But if they were to just appoint someone that, or if they were to, if they were to appoint a new Secretary of Defense, that person could obviously be replaced. So the judgeships will stand if they get any more. They've already gotten a lot. In that category of, right, the Trump administration has already appointed a lot of federal judges. So I think they've already had a lot of success there. So it's hard to imagine them moving the dial anymore in the last few weeks. But other than that, I don't really have anything else to shed light on there.
Great.
Okay.
Cool. I will say that if I can again allow me a plug for our organisation. I know we've talked about some of the more unseen parts of the presidential transition process, particularly between this formal transition period as we see now. Some more information around the kind of gold standard of transition. You can go to Presidential Transition Central, and there's just a lot of really interesting pieces there. If people want to know more, can kind of further, I guess expand on. We've only got an hour here to talk to cover so much stuff, but direct people to that if they'd like to. I think we've got another question coming in here. Let me see. What would you say to young people who might feel very discouraged about pursuing careers in government today, given the way career civil servants have been treated lately? I don't know. Kenny, do you want to take that one? I can offer some thoughts after.
This requires me to be inspiring and optimistic. I'll give it my best, but if you look at the federal workforce, I mean, Chantelle, you probably know much more about the surveys, or your organization probably does these surveys. My understanding is that the federal workforce tends to be much older than the private workforce. They tend to have served for a long time. And they're doing all kinds of things that require them to be up on new technologies and new trainings that the people at the students at the University of Michigan are being trained up on. So I guess the first thing I would say is, if you want your government to look like you and to represent your interests, the government needs you, and a career in public service is something you should strongly consider. And in many ways, people talk about it as a thankless job, but it's or at least the ones that I've talked to about it have talked about it as a thankless job. But they've also, they find the career civil servants that I've talked to find a profound meaning in their positions, and they stay in their positions because they ultimately care about the work that they're doing. And what could be better than that? So,
well, I mean, I am a big advocate of government. I think the thing that you can't get anywhere else serving in government is impact, is mission and impact. You think about many of the unseen roles that happen. Certainly, like in my job, one of the things that I love about what I do is I get to work with many of these incredible federal public servants that do an incredible job, serving the American public, and whether that be directly or indirectly. I did a project around transformation of federal finance, and we worked with the federal financial community about how can government provide services better to the public using many of the technology innovations so that, you know, you're moving from paper-based to online, you know, which it sounds kind of a little bit snoozy if it's not like an exciting dinner party conversation, but like it's just really important, right? If those things don't work, things don't work. And so I think just encourage you to that person, I definitely pursue a career. You know, you think about some of the cybersecurity challenges, you think about the proliferation of data, AI, technology that really is changing the work that government does, and needs people with those skill sets to be able to prepare government to make the shift from what it was through to this kind of new reality, if you will. And so it's incredibly important. And I think it's probably even more important now, given, you know, some of the challenges that, you know, in this chat we've been both talking about and the questions have been alluding to. You know, government needs talented people to make a difference. And I truly don't mean that in a trite way. It matters, like it really does matter. Yeah, I'm just very passionate about that. Go surf, get into government, it's important.
So how, just on the practical, how, let's say that they were just inspired, what would they actually do next to do this?
Sure.
No advice?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would talk to people, a couple of things. Use your networks. And I'm sure, you know, for example, the university, like speak to your careers folk about, you know, what in government you might want to do, what areas that you could make an impact. Search people out, you know, LinkedIn, you know, through your networks, talk to people in government about what it's like for them. I know the partnership has, I keep plugging our stuff, the SAMIs, Service to America medals. Go read the stories, get inspired, and think about how you can, you know, reach out to those people. They're always willing to be aware and to be available to talk to that. So again, I'm trying to get tactical, like have conversations, use your networks. Also, like look on the job sites, you know, USA Jobs. I think that's still the case. I'm aging myself here. You know, look at the jobs available in government and apply. You know, while we're bringing it back to like transition, you know, you have 4,000 political appointees that you know, vacancies that need to be filled. You know, get connected with the through the Build Back Better, the transition website, to find out more. Yeah, that would be my practical suggestions about how you can get more informed and then express your interest that way. Yeah,
and just one, since we're all plugging our organizations, say that there are ways at the University of Michigan for you to get involved in that as well, right? So there's, off the top of my head, there's the program on practical policy engagement at the Ford School, and there are all kinds of programs in which you could get involved in Washington, seeing what it would be like to work there. So as a final plug, I'll mention that in case there are any students.
Awesome. I think that's like, I'm just also conscious of time. We've hit 6:30 and it certainly went very quickly. So yeah.
Okay. Thanks a lot, everyone. This is great.
Thanks, everyone.